Uh, Good morning, everyone, again. I'm Pallavi Ade. I am your co host along with Shreyas Deshmukh and also the co founders of Asian Pathfinders. Thank you for joining on another edition of a Fireside Chat. We've been doing this since last year. We are nearly nearing our 50th. Not yet, but yeah, we'll soon get there. So thank you for who join us regularly and who are new today. So just before we hand it over to Sanjay and Mihir about Asian Pathfinders, like I said, we started in 2020. We are a knowledge sharing platform where we aim to bring scholars, practitioners, academics together for very constructive dialogue. How we do that is obviously the Saturday fireside chats, which are held nearly every Saturday unless there's some holiday. So here we try and get one or two experts to do a much more detailed analysis of a specific topic. We also hold dialogues, which are kind of a panel discussion where we get experts from various fields on a specific theme. And we just held one last this Thursday, and we had it on India's neighborhood policies, but more looking at the neighbor's perspective. And as we keep saying, it's an informal forum, so it's also for you to contribute if you want to join us as a speaker. If you have a specific topic or anything else, also please write to us. So about our upcoming sessions, next week we have on energy and connectivity, geoeconomics of Central Asia. So kind of the central theme for most of the sessions this week has been geopolitics, politics around that. So continuing that, we are moving to Central Asia from Myanmar all the way jumping that side. Also, we are really glad to say that we have the Swiss ambassador joining us at the end of this week, Ambassador Dr. Ralph Heckner. He's the Swiss ambassador to India and Bhutan, and he'll be speaking on the topic from, excuse me, from global to digital governance, Switzerland as the hub of international policy. And in the month of March, we have a series of sessions planned, fireside chats as well as dialogues on women-centric issues on the occasion of International Women's Day. So, just the community guidelines, I know Shreyas does post it in the chat, but we just ask you to respect the views of others, but please ask your questions and put in your comments in the chat section. Respect intellectual property. A lot of people who join our platforms share their research here, part of their research here. So if you want to use that in any of your papers or any thing that you're writing on, reach out to them. Also, just the language that you use here, do not post any defamatory content, and also promotional content here without permission. And just trust me and Asian Pathfinders, you can find us on social media, so you can definitely do that. And moving on to today's session, the session is related to the current political crisis in Myanmar. We have Sanjay Pulipaka speaking. He's a senior fellow at Delhi Policy Group. And we have Mihir Bhonsale, who is the moderator. So I'll introduce Mihir and then I'll pass it on to him for the rest of the proceedings. Mihir is an independent strategic affairs and foreign policy analyst based in Calcutta, or Kolkata, how it's called now. Previously, as faculty expert with Strategic Studies Program of Observer Research Foundation, Mihir has authored many research articles focusing on India's bilateral engagement with its neighbors, including Bhutan, China, and Myanmar. He has published papers on a range of topics that include the Sino-India border, India's power outreach in Southeast Asia, the Rohingya crisis, and India-Myanmar relations. Bhutan's transition to democracy and bilateral relations with India, and the BBI and motor vehicle agreement. So that's a long list of publications, Mihir. Over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Pallavi. Thanks, Shreyas. Thank you, Asian Pathfinders, for inviting me for this session on Myanmar. It's a very topical issue. Myanmar, as you all know, is a Southeast Asian country. In fact, the largest Southeast Asian country. And India is a neighbor of Myanmar. It shares a 1,600-kilometer border, mostly with the northeastern states of Arunachal, Mizoram, Manipur, and Nagaland. So Myanmar is an important country. Up till 1937, it was a part of British India. When it was carved out as a separate colony. So Myanmar and India share a common heritage in terms of in terms of culture, there are complementarities in culture. Also, there is communities living on the border in Northeast India where you have a similarity in language, in food tradition. Actually, the same ethnicities are on both sides of the border. So it's an important country, and the political situation there, the situation there is also very important for us to understand and look forward to. So without wasting much time, I would like to invite Sanjay Pulipaka, who is the speaker today, to introduce Sanjay. Sanjay is a senior fellow at Senior Fellow for Research Programs and Strategic Neighbourhood with the Delhi Policy Group. He was previously a Senior Fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum Library and Senior Consultant at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Sanjay was a Pavate Visiting Fellow at University of Cambridge, UK, and a former Fulbright Fellow in Conflict Transformation Program in the United States. Sanjay's areas of interest include India's foreign policy, East Asian issues, India-US relations, China, Indian politics, regionalism, connectivity, trade. Further, he has been closely following the political transition in Myanmar and conducted field research in that country and in Northeast India. Sanjay has also extensive work experience with think tanks and civil society organizations in India. He has considerable work experience in strengthening participatory political processes, governance frameworks, and platforms for wider consultation. He has substantive publication record with 3 co-edited volumes, policy reports, numerous research papers, and opinion editorial essays. So here's a short, I would say, introduction of Sanjay, whom I know for some time. He came to ORF for a session on Myanmar. So welcome, Sanjay. Welcome to this fireside chat. And I hand it over to you for your presentation. Then we can have the question and answer session. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste. Good morning. Good morning to all the participants. My thanks to Asian Pathfinders, specifically Shreyas and Pallavi for hosting this session. My thanks to Mihir for chairing the session. I've known Mihir from my Calcutta days when I used to work at Maulana Azad Institute for Asian Studies there. And of course, we met in ORF events as well to discuss issues of common interest, which is specifically Myanmar. And I've kept track of his writings and other things, and other publications that he does, which I find useful. I have a power cut here. So I'm using multiple internet connections. So if you have problem with my voice, do let me know. I'll switch off my video, and then we can only focus on the talk. So to start off, today is Saturday 13th February. On Feb 1st, Myanmar military took over power. In Myanmar, the Myanmar military overthrew the civilian government headed by President Win Myint, and of course Aung San Suu Kyi was an important player in that, and for all practical purposes the leader of the government as state councillor. Both of them were arrested and they were placed under house arrest. And this was done allegedly under Article 417 of the Myanmar Constitution, which empowers Myanmar President to impose state of emergency. But the curious thing here is that Myanmar President himself is under prison. He is in prison and is under arrest. And this state of emergency has been declared by the Vice President. So there is a certain amount of constitutional debate going on as to whether vice president can declare a state of emergency. But when it comes to military takeovers, constitutional propriety is rarely a concern. I mean, when military wants to take over power, quite often they tend to take over power. Of course, whether they can hold on to it is a question that we can debate subsequently. I mean, this military takeover in Myanmar comes after a spectacular election result in November 2020 when Suu Kyi swept Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy swept the elections and came to power with almost 80% of winning almost 80% of the seats. In fact, compared to previous elections in 2015, Suu Kyi and her NLD increased their electoral performance, which is interesting to note. Probably the military thought that going by the media reports in international media and national media, that Suu Kyi popularity may have been dented, and so therefore they shall come back with reduced, what we say, a number of seats in the parliament, and they hoped probably that with reduced number of seats in parliament, Suu Kyi will have to form a coalition government, and Myanmar military with 25% seats in Myanmar parliament reserved for Myanmar military, they will be able to define the political trajectory or the political process immediately after elections. But as it turned out, after November elections, Suu Kyi actually came up with an increased electoral majority, and the prospect of Myanmar military defining the political trajectory started looking little bleak. So therefore, it is said that Myanmar military started talking about the electoral malpractices and voting malpractices, saying that the voter lists are problematic, and therefore they need to the electoral verdict needs to be looked at. But there is a larger point here, is that many of the international NGOs or local NGOs, they have not questioned the electoral process. Yes, there may have been some minor mistakes here and there, but in voter rolls and other places, like it happens in all democracies. But the argument given by many election observers, including international observers, was that the electoral process was largely free and fair, and there was no large-scale systemic electoral malpractice. And given Myanmar military's own track record of conducting elections and honoring them, there was also a lot of skepticism about Myanmar military's claim that the electoral process was completely vitiated. So that's one area that needs that has been a source of friction between NLD, the ruling NLD, and Myanmar military. But if you take a larger picture, the internal and the external dynamic in which the military coup took place is qualitatively different from military coups that happened earlier in Myanmar. One, today there is a lot of digital connectivity, there is a lot of movement of people. Myanmar economy is very plugged into the international economy. So therefore, the context in which the military coup took place is qualitatively different. So, and it is also interesting that Aung San Suu Kyi did not fundamentally go against the roadmap of Myanmar military. It did not. She and NLD did not. They did not undermine the core interests of Myanmar military. One, what are those core interests? One, there is an ongoing ethnic conflict, and there are various ethnic armed groups. There are various ethnic parties, ethnic organizations who have been calling for genuine federalism. Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD did not come up with a radical plan to devolve power or give a substantial autonomy or grant autonomy to ethnic groups in various parts of the country. On the contrary, various ethnic groups were deeply disappointed with Suu Kyi's lack of progress on federalism, and yet the Myanmar military overthrew Aung San Suu Kyi. The second component where she did not go against the interests of Myanmar military substantially was with reference to her economic policies. Her economic policies did not fundamentally alter undermine the economic interests of the Myanmar military and its military families. I mean, there have been various news reports and other reports which says that Myanmar military families are also into big business, and they have not been negatively impacted by the opening up of Myanmar economy and its interactions with the outside world. So actually this Myanmar military coup actually undermines this growing external economic engagement of various business groups that were benefiting from the opening up process. The other point that needs to be noted is Suu Kyi did not go on a witch hunt against the Myanmar military leaders, saying that, look, you have committed human rights violations in the past, so therefore you need to be held accountable. So there was no fear on that dimension as well. Instead, we have seen that Aung San Suu Kyi was supporting Myanmar military on various international platforms against allegations of genocide. That is another important important dimension that needs to be noted, that Suu Kyi was making strenuous efforts to reach out to Myanmar military, and therefore and yet, in spite of that, we have this military coup coming into play. There have been arguments which say that probably Suu Kyi was moving very close to China, and so therefore Myanmar military felt uncomfortable with the growing imbalance in Myanmar's foreign policy. Now, what is the evidence that is advanced for such an allegation? It is pointed out that Suu Kyi's foundation, which she runs on, in the name of her mother, received funding from Chinese business personnel. But it appears that this foundation also took donations from various other players as well. The second argument that is made is that Suu Kyi was slowly agreeing to Chinese facilitated negotiations with Bangladesh, and she was willing to take back Rohingya refugees back into the country. Now, if that is indeed the case, then the military coup and the military, by taking over and refusing to accommodate Rohingya refugees back into the country, would mean that they are going against the interests of China. I mean, after all, China loses face in international arena if it's facilitated, if its negotiations or the outcomes of negotiations are so blatantly violated by Myanmar military. But these are all allegations. We don't know how far that is. These allegations are true. But one thing is certain now, that given that Myanmar military has is back in power by overthrowing a civilian government, they need the support of they need the support of China on various international platforms. So therefore, Myanmar government today under military leadership is much more dependent on China than previous NLD government, because they need Chinese support to fend off criticism on international platforms and to fend off various policy measures that many Western countries will be taking against the military government in Myanmar. Already we have seen Joe Biden calling for quick restoration of the democratic government. He called on Myanmar military to relinquish power. And more importantly, he announced that his government is taking all steps to prevent generals from improperly having access to $1 billion in Burmese government funds, which are parked in United States. This is another dimension that United States will not take military coup lightly. and will not the Myanmar military generals will not have it easy dealing with the United States government, because Joe Biden has also said that he has approved an executive order enabling immediate sanction on military leaders that directed the coup, their business interests, as well as the business interests of close family members. So therefore, what we are seeing is that United States is doubling down on Myanmar military, which means that essentially Myanmar military will require more and more support of China. So China in the near future at least has now greater leverage in Myanmar because of the military coup and the consequences that are shaping up. And there are also a lot of protests in front of Chinese embassy in Myanmar, saying that it is their support which is enabling Myanmar military to continue in power. There is a challenge for India as well in terms of international response. India has expressed deep concern at the developments and has noted that the rule of law and democratic process must be upheld. We have our own challenges in dealing with the evolving situation in Myanmar. One, we have, as Mihir pointed out earlier, a direct boundary with Myanmar, and various states such as Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram share boundary with Myanmar. So, and there are also ethnic communities living on both sides of the border which share common culture, common ethnic identity, and economic interactions that are shaping up. I mean, in the past few days, we have seen how we have seen demonstrations in Mizoram as well, calling for end of military rule, because the Chin ethnic community on the other side, in the Chin state of Myanmar, have close ethnic relations with Mizos living in India. So therefore, there have been protests in Mizoram as well. So therefore, the ethnic interactions across the border are intense. That is something that we need to factor in. The other important challenge that India has is the connectivity networks that it is operationalizing. So how do you deal with these connectivity projects going forward with Myanmar military rule? What is its impact going to be on connectivity projects? Of course, the other issue is the general overall security situation that is evolving in the northern Myanmar. Various ethnic groups are there, various ethnic armed groups are there. So therefore, how do you deal with it? I mean, if the military coup results in intensification of ethnic conflict, then it will obviously have spillover impact on northeastern India security as well. So that is another dimension that needs to be kept in mind. In terms of other international players, United Nations Security Council, after much deliberations, was able to pass a resolution expressing deep concern on the developments and termed the arrest of Suu Kyi and President Win Myint as arbitrary and called for their immediate release. And they have called for greater dialogue and reconciliation based on will of the people. And this is challenging in the sense that if Myanmar military conducts another election now, Suu Kyi will again come back to power with greater majority. So how are they going to deal with this complex situation now is something that we need to maintain close observation. We need to follow very closely. At the moment, there are protests all over Myanmar taking place. All major cities in all major regions have witnessed strong protests taking place, and we have witnessed that people are from various age groups are participating in protests. There have been symbolic protests such as banging of vessels, pots at night, daily that is happening, honking. Drivers, when they're driving on the road, they were honking vigorously, along with the banging of pots and vessels at night, expressing displeasure. There have been large-scale protests on the streets as well, all through the daytime. And since yesterday night, situation has become slightly more troublesome because there were reports that Myanmar military was picking up some of the government officials who have expressed their desire for restoration of democracy. What is interesting is some of the government officials, especially in medical community, teachers, and other communities in government sector, have started expressing support for the protesters and for restoration of democracy. In some instances in Kaya state, which is on bordering Thailand, we have noted that some of the police personnel also joined the protest. Thus far, nobody from the military has expressed any support for restoration of democracy, but the fact that some of the police personnel are joining the protest is an important sign that needs to be kept in mind. So since yesterday night, what has happened is there were reports that Myanmar military was picking up some of the doctors, medical community members, and other officials who had expressed support, and there was a night-long vigil in various cities trying to protect these government officials who have expressed support for the restoration of democracy. The scale of protests has increased substantially and significantly, and they have also been very creative in the style of protests. They have adopted some of the symbols from neighboring countries, such as saluting through three finger salute, which is essentially coming from, I think, TV series Hunger Games, or so that salute was also being adopted. It is also an indication as to how globalized the current protests are, unlike the previous protests of, say, in 1988 or monks' protests in 2007. What has been NLD's response to all this? NLD's top leadership is in prison, while some of the leaders are expressing support, asking people. I mean, there was allegedly a Suu Kyi statement on Facebook calling on people to protest and not to accept the military dictatorship. There were also reports that NLD elected members declared themselves to be the parliament, and they have appointed Suu Kyi as the state councillor, which is also a new development that has taken place. So if that is indeed the case, then it is going to make the contest between Myanmar military and democracy activists even more intense in the coming days. Unlike the 1988 and the 2007 monk protests, what we are seeing is growing use of digital media to mobilize people and to articulate grievances. I mean, Myanmar military is concerned about losing the narrative on digital platforms, so they sought to curtail internet for a night. I think a few days ago they made an attempt to shut down the internet. They shut down the internet, but within a few hours they restored internet across the country, because Myanmar military suddenly realized that, unlike in 2010 or prior to 2010, what Myanmar economy today is also digitally enabled. I mean, a lot of ATMs are there today. Prior to 2010, if you went to Myanmar, there were only a few ATMs in the city, and in 2007 or 2005 and 6, probably there was only 1 or 2 ATMs in the central Yangon, which was more of a tourist place for people to go and see ATM rather than withdraw money from that. Today, but Myanmar economy is digitally enabled. The tourism is digitally driven. Airline ticketing is digitally driven. So suddenly, if you shut down internet, Myanmar military itself suddenly realized that the economy is going to be seriously impacted. So it restored the internet connection. Now there is a challenge here for Myanmar military, is that it needs to create new firewalls like the Chinese and the other countries do, authoritarian countries. How do you quickly bring up firewalls which will facilitate communication, which is necessary for the functioning of economy, but at the same time curtail anti-government protests and identify protesters? So there were concerns that China is supplying these technologies in the past few days to Myanmar military in a big way. There were rumors that Chinese flights have landed, which were again later debunked, saying that they were carrying essential humanitarian and medical supplies. But the point is, if Myanmar military has to keep internet open, then it will require firewalls like the Chinese firewalls to control information flows. That is something that needs to be noted, and that again demonstrates that Myanmar military will be dependent on China again in maintaining that its own digital platforms, its own digital environment. So not surprisingly, many of the young people today are protesting, and one of their concerns is that their access to internet and the freedoms that they enjoyed in on digital platforms will be lost. So therefore, we are seeing again, as I pointed out earlier, a lot of protests in front of Chinese embassy, calling on China not to support the Myanmar military government. Moving forward, the economy is also going to be a big challenge for Myanmar, because Myanmar economy was already reeling under severe economic crisis because of COVID-19 related shutdowns and the slowdown in global economy, and collapse of tourism as well, because Myanmar also receives considerable tourist inflows. Now, with Myanmar military coup and the political uncertainty that has come into play, Myanmar economy will further experience or move down a downward spiral, move along those lines, which is not good for the Myanmar military. The ongoing crisis will discourage foreign investments. Already there is reduced labor presence in many of the industries, especially textile sector. So this is going to have a negative impact on Myanmar's economy as well. So what next in terms of how does this situation get resolved? It's a very complicated situation now, because if Suu Kyi is released and if the civilian government is restored because of large-scale protests, then the next generation or the next government and the new generation of youngsters are keen that Myanmar military, Tatmadaw as they say, should be forever removed from the decision-making processes. So there will be an immediate demand to reduce the Myanmar military presence in legislatures and executive. So that is going to be a big challenge. So Myanmar military cannot immediately restore a civilian government. If you don't allow restore a civilian government, you cannot have the protests will continue, which is another challenge that Myanmar military will have to deal with. If protests are going to continue, there will be an economic crisis. So Myanmar military, I think, is in a very tough spot at the moment. If they release civilian leadership, it will result in outcomes which are not favorable to the military. If they don't release the civilian leadership like Suu Kyi and others, then it will result in continued protests and international condemnation. If they try to organize new elections, Suu Kyi will come back with greater power. Like 2010, if they come up with new provisions to conduct elections where Suu Kyi will have to lose significant power, then Suu Kyi and NLD may not participate in such elections, which again results in greater protests and international condemnation. It appears that this round of protests will be determined by the persistence and the resilience of the youngsters who are protesting on the streets of Yangon, Mandalay, and other big cities. And of course, the stance that is taken by the international community as well. So therefore, we are Myanmar today is in a very delicate situation, and I don't think Myanmar military may have thought through all these phases of the protests and other things adequately before taking over military power. So in that sense, at least in the next few months, Myanmar is going to go through a very turbulent phase, and we in India and in the Indian government will have to closely monitor situation, because we have large stakes in a neighboring country with which we share a significant border. So therefore, it's very important. And for the larger democratic movement across the world, till recently people used to say that while Arab Spring failed, the democratic transition in Myanmar was progressing smoothly, of course with many challenges. But today even the democratic movement in Myanmar took a backseat. So if you look at on continental Southeast Asia, democracy across the continental ASEAN countries. Continental Southeast Asia is under severe threat, and in many places totally absent. So going forward in that sense, restoring democracy is going to be challenging and also sometimes probably necessary as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. It was an exhaustive list of points that you touched upon. A very comprehensive picture we all have in front of us now. And already questions have started pouring. So if I could go to the questions one by one. Yes, the first question is by Suvarna Deshmukh. She asks, do you see any relation between the timing of the coup in Myanmar and the new US administration and the larger competition in the Indo-Pacific region? Can we take more questions and then?
Yeah, let us bunch few questions in.
Yes. Maybe a related question. Is it true that Burma's military coup leaders do not care sanction because maybe China and Russia support them? The third question is, how is this coup different from the 1962 and 1990 coups? How Biden administration should approach Burmese military now, as further sanctions will push them in China's lap, as happened earlier? So these are the three questions. We can have your responses and then go back to.
Yeah, on the timing of the coup, it is important to note that the trigger for this coup is essentially domestic, in the sense that Myanmar military felt that power is slipping away from their hands. But they may have factored in the international environment, but the dominant variable in this decision making is essentially domestic, as to how powerful Suu Kyi is becoming, and the probability that Suu Kyi may bring in reforms to reduce military's presence in the legislatures, which will come into play, say, from 2025 onwards. But nonetheless, in the short term as well, many of the decisions that she may be taking, she will be taking without any consultations with Myanmar military. That's the concern probably they had. So the timing of the coup has got a lot to do with domestic factors. On the whether Biden administration coming into play or not is something that probably was one of the factors, but I think they must have, if they thought along those lines, the Myanmar military leaders, then anybody who was looking at US politics will know that Biden administration cannot let Myanmar military consolidate, given the fact that they are coming back with a lot of focus on values and foreign policy. For them now, it has become a test case, and we have to wait and see how far the United States is willing to go to restore, to ensure that democratic players are strengthened within Myanmar. Related to that is the question on economic sanctions that was raised as well. There is also a lot of thinking in international community based on the previous experiences. How do you sanction Myanmar military leaders? See, sanctions should be comprehensive, but it should hit the intended target very clearly. Here, it is not the people of Myanmar that you are sanctioning. You want to sanction Myanmar military. So if you want to sanction Myanmar military, how do you sanction Myanmar military without impacting the general public? Because the sources of Myanmar military's powers are all domestic, in the sense that there is a lot of natural resources which Myanmar military used to control and still controls, whether it is jade and other precious mineral resources, whether it is forest resources, whether it's their ability to sell natural gas from Shui gas field and the other gas fields to China and Thailand. So these are all the resources that come from. And as pointed out, yes, China and Russia are the important supporters of Myanmar military. So how do you impose sanctions, inflict economic pain? without targeting without impacting the lives of ordinary Myanmar people. That's an important challenge. Even the EU officials also pointed out during the recent discussions on this. That is, how do you inflict such pain, targeted pain on Myanmar military? That is something which is going to be a big challenge moving forward in terms of imposing sanctions. But general economic slowdown because of Myanmar military coup is something that is going to generate a lot of pressure on Myanmar military. And in terms of how is this different from 1962 or 1990 and earlier military coups, as I pointed out, the information flows. One is the digital connectivity that has happened in the recent past. The information flows that are taking place is qualitatively different from the earlier time. The other major difference is in 1960s, there was full-scale insurgencies across Myanmar where various ethnic armies were exceptionally, extremely powerful, and they were contesting the state apparatus of Myanmar. The Myanmar government was contested, and there was a genuine concern among large segments of population of those times that probably the country will disintegrate. The fear of disintegration today is not as intense as it was in 1960s. So therefore, the Myanmar military's attempts to draw legitimacy as trying to protect the unity of Myanmar will not draw same amount of probably some resonance which was found earlier will not be prevalent or present today in terms of its role as protector of national unity, because the concerns of disintegration of Myanmar today are not as intense as it was earlier. So that's the other dimension. And as I pointed out, in terms of economic interactions, Myanmar military, various sectors are much more plugged into Myanmar, into international economy, for instance, textiles, tourism, and other sectors as well. Even agriculture and farming sectors are also much more plugged into international interaction. So Myanmar military coup, therefore, in that sense, is happening in a qualitatively different context today.
Yes. Moving on to the next questions. There's one question by Pallavi on what has been the response of the monks to the current coup. Would any support to NLD of the monks make any difference? Related to that, I think, is Shreya's question on the intricacies of the Rohingya issue. Can you please explain the intricacies of the Rohingya issue, the coup, and implication on the region? And the third question, I think it's more of a comment, but also you answered it partly. The military's concern for its over-dependence of China was on the was one of the major reasons for welcoming openness and democracy in Myanmar in 2010, after which military was embraced by the West. Why should China now trust the military again and extend large-scale support to the military if they were betrayed in 2010? So I think these three questions you can respond.
Yeah, one of the things on monks is that we are yet to see large-scale institutional participation of the Saffron Brotherhood, as they say. Yes, there have been instances when monks also participated in the recent protest, but unlike the Saffron Revolution or the monk protest that happened in 2007, the current protests are being led by people, for lack of better word, from secular dimensions of society. Many youngsters, ordinary people, civilians, citizens. If monks also get added to this through their institutional frameworks, then it will become qualitatively different. But there have been instances where we have seen in photographs and other places where some monks have participated. But whether Sangha as an institution taken a decision to lean on this side onto the side of protesters is still not clear. If that happens, then it will tip the table substantially. On the issue of intricacies of Rohingya crisis, as I pointed out, one of the arguments that was going around was that Suu Kyi was willing to take back some of the Rohingya refugees, and therefore Myanmar military stepped in. But the question is, if that is indeed the case, then China, which has been facilitating the negotiations, would have been very unhappy because it lost face with reference to Bangladesh. So how is Myanmar military going to handle that situation? Which means that Myanmar military will have to participate more in Belt and Road Initiative activities to please the Chinese. But the question is, on Rohingya issue, the Myanmar military coup will not fundamentally alter the dynamics there on the ground in the Rakhine state. In fact, if at all Myanmar military will have to take stronger position as a protector of Buddhist persuasion so therefore they will have to be much more strong. They will be much more strong armed with reference to Rohingya crisis. They cannot be seen to be soft on Rohingya crisis. So therefore that is going to be an important dimension in terms of Myanmar military policies towards Rohingya. The second component is Suu Kyi is no longer mediating the interactions between Myanmar military and the international community on Rohingya issue. Now Myanmar military will have to deal with the international community directly on Rohingya issue. So there is no buffer there, which means that to articulate what they think is happening on the ground. So therefore, on Rohingya issue, Myanmar military is now much more vulnerable than before. So that is something that they will have to deal with. In terms of dependence on China, it is true that there were some elements within Myanmar ruling elite at the time of 2010 who wanted diversified international engagement to reduce dependence on China. But that did not result in Chinese interests getting undermined fundamentally. Most of the Chinese projects were implemented on time. I have moved forward. So therefore, yes, there has been suspension of Midson Dam and renegotiation of Leptadung copper mine project. But China's economic interests in that sense have not been fundamentally undermined. What has happened is diversification, which does not necessarily mean that China's economic interests have been undermined. The second thing here is in politics, as they say, there are no friends and enemies, permanent enemies and permanent friends. That is more so in international politics as well. So therefore, what we are seeing is a renegotiation of the relationship between China and Myanmar military. Myanmar military requires China much more than before. So therefore, China will encash check sometime soon rather than later. And China also has various leverages in play in Myanmar, whether it is in ethnic peace process, whether it is in terms of supporting various ethnic groups, and also larger presence in Myanmar economy. So in that sense, China never disappeared from the Myanmar's economic, political, and social landscape between 2010 and 2020. It was always there, and its consolidation will be even more today after the military coup.
The next question is from Niyaz Wahid. He asks, there has been a huge outpouring resistance of common citizens against the coup. What has been the stand of other political parties, like the ethnic parties, and would the military have any pressure from the country's citizens? If other political parties don't support the NL, would the military feel empowered?
See, at the moment, cutting a... Yeah. So, do you want me to take one more question, or?
Well, I just wanted to ask you, when I visited Myanmar in 20 years back, that time I visited the Kachin state, and I found that the ethnic politics is very different from the Bamar politics. The nationalist Bamar political narrative is different from the ethnic party's narrative. And also during NLD's term, Suu Kyi's term in power, we saw that there was some kind of indifference to the NLD government in Rakhine, in northern Myanmar. So how do you see it panning out in the military, under the military?
Yeah. In that sense, the earlier question on various political parties and the issues that you have raised are interrelated. One, there is a full spectrum, across the spectrum of society participation in the recent protests we are seeing. So various, probably party which is close to Myanmar military is not definitely participating in these protests. But otherwise, large segments of societies are participating in this, and we are also seeing protests in various ethnic regions as well, whether it is in Shan state or Kayin state. I mean, the police joining protesters happened in Kaya state, which is an ethnically dominated state. As Mihir pointed out, there is a disappointment with Suu Kyi or indifference towards her government because she did not devolve power or strengthen federalism to the extent the Myanmar ethnic minorities wanted it. But at the same time, the emergence of military dictatorship is not in the interest of the ethnic groups. It is true they are unhappy with the decentralization of Suu Kyi, but with Myanmar military in power, there is greater centralization of power now, where ethnic parties cannot even articulate their concerns. They cannot freely express their concerns. So that is going to be a challenge. So for many ethnic parties, it's a very tough situation. The situation they were in, the conversations they were having with NLD were unhappy, but the current political development brings it even down, a step down or a few steps down in terms of ethnic empowerment. So because how do you expect Myanmar military to decentralize power? So that is going to be an important fault line that will continue in the coming months. And Myanmar military cannot empower ethnic regions while ensuring that its dictatorship is strong in Burma regions, right? I mean, that will also generate a lot of stress. In that sense, there is now more common ground because of the Myanmar military coup, between various ethnic groups and the majority Burman population, because at least in the immediate future, they have to overthrow the military rule. So that is something that one needs to look at. Of course, there have been reports that Myanmar military is considering the next elections under proportional representation, so that Suu Kyi's majority can be undermined, because with 51% vote share, you are ending up with 80% of the seats, whereas USDP with 20% or less than 20% vote share is ending up with some 10 seats or 20 seats or 30 seats or whatever. So that's a thing that they would like to address. And some of the ethnic groups may feel that the proportional representation may benefit them, because today, even in Kachin state and other places, NLD has performed well. There have been concerns that because of the migrant population has been empowered, so therefore NLD has won the elections in Kachin state. But if Kachin ethnic parties are getting 40% of vote share or 30%, but it is not getting translated into seats. So if Myanmar military is planning to bring elections under proportional representation, it may generate some conversations, but it will have its own negative political dynamics that they will have to deal with. So that is something that Myanmar military will have to deal with again. But the point is, there are these new areas for Myanmar military, like proportional representation, the discussions on that, which may create platforms to engage with various ethnic groups, but we don't know how these ethnic groups will respond, because they will have to do their own calculations as to how elections under proportional representations will have an impact on the composition of legislatures. These are all the complexities that are involved in Myanmar's current political crisis.
Moving on to the next question, there's a question from Pallavi as to, it's a long-term question. She asks, the face of Myanmar's democracy is Suu Kyi. What happens to the future of Myanmar's democracy post her? And if I may add, I also wanted to understand if the one-man leadership or one-person leadership of NLD by Suki is hampering the party's interests in the long term?
See, this is a question that quite often Myanmar observers reflect upon, right? I mean, the towering personality of Suu Kyi and the absence of second-rung leadership. What are its implications for Myanmar's democratic politics? I mean, I've been thinking about it. The other way of asking a question is, how come there was no leaders that are emerging other than Suu Kyi? I mean, it's not as if Suu Kyi is trying to stop people, right, from emerging. And in politics, is not, as Indian politicians point out, it is not Sant Sabha or something like that. You have to fight for your power, and you have to take contest elections, impress people, and take power. So it is not something that people will give you in a bowl and say, okay, from now on, you are the leader. So how come the new generation politics has not found the new leadership? Probably my feeling is the current protests may throw up some new leaders because of the advent and the proliferation of social media and the use of social media platforms. We are seeing a lot of youngsters, but there are no individuals around which this is consolidating. Or revolving. In a way, it is good because if you take out few individuals, then the protests will die because it is now generalized, spread around. So therefore, it will have endurance. But if you don't have some sort of leadership of at least few people, then the possibility of fizzling out of protests is also very high, because the common people cannot sustain protests without direction, guidance, and to use Marxian language, a headquarters is required to guide a movement. So that is something that needs to be looked into. The other thing is, when opportunity opens up, probably you will find leaders taking on. We have seen it in India, we have seen it other places. I mean, there have been instances when people thought so and so will not be a good prime minister, but they turned out to be good prime ministers in Indian context. Probably, or you take former President Thein Sein. He was seen as a former military general, but the moment he came to power, he became a reformer, in the sense that he was advancing the cause of opening up of country. Suddenly, former President Thein Sein became an image of reformer. We have to wait and see how he will respond to the current political crisis. A statement from him will fundamentally shift the equations within Myanmar military as well. So that is, I mean, see, these are all the dynamics. And then there was this talk about Shwe Man, right? The Speaker of the House emerging as a dominant leader. We need to see how he will play out this, the protests. So in that sense, the leadership is not something that is given to in politics on a platter to new generation saying henceforth tilak laga ke ab se aap chalao. That won't happen in politics. It boils down people taking leadership and taking it forward. I think this protest will be the platform for such kind of developments. But let us see, wait and see. You are on mute, Mihir.
The next question is on Japan. I wanted to ask this, and also there's a question from the audience, Sriparna. She asked, what is the future of the projects which Japan and India is pursuing in Myanmar? And my question to you is that how Japan has played it has taken a very different, it has a different reaction to the coup in Myanmar. So how do you see whether Japan and India's position will qualitatively differ from the positions of the Western world, or it will conquer?
I mean, obviously, given India's geographic location right next to Myanmar, as I pointed out earlier, the ethnic similarities in the border regions, the connectivity projects, and our own investments will have an impact in the way we respond to Myanmar crisis. And it will be different from the sanctions approach of Western countries. That doesn't mean that both India and Japan will not be pushing for rapid restoration of some sort of equilibrium that will take movement towards democracy to acquire greater momentum. But even Japan, as you pointed out, has invested heavily in Myanmar. The Tilawa Special Economic Zone is there, where the Japanese have invested, more than 70 to 80 companies have invested. And Japan is involved in the railway networks of Myanmar, Mandalay Yangon railway network, the circular railway in Yangon. So Myanmar, Japanese investments on Myanmar are substantial, and therefore they are also worried about how these things are going to impact. And see, the Myanmar military is also now in a bind. They cannot simply cancel these projects. It only means that they will be moving more closer to China. And if you start canceling Japanese projects and Japanese funded developmental projects, then you will have to deal with more pressure, and you will be becoming more and more closer to China. So therefore, they will allow these companies, I mean, these business activities to continue, and overseas development assistance from Japan to gain momentum. So same goes with India as well. I mean, they cannot fundamentally undermine our interests. So in that sense, Myanmar military will not fundamentally alter the trajectory of Japanese investments. The question is the nature of Myanmar economy itself. Because of the the political crisis that is there, the Myanmar economy is going to experience severe crisis. Then why should companies from Japan or India be investing in Myanmar? So Myanmar military generals will have to quickly resolve the current political crisis if they want to ensure diversity of players in the economic landscape. So that is a challenge for Myanmar military as well, not just a challenge for India or Japan. If they are truly interested in maintaining diversity of players in economic landscape, then they will have to fundamentally quickly alter this political crisis. So that is something that is also a responsibility there of Myanmar military.
I think you have already touched upon this question, but Mohit is asking what could be India's role, since it is part of the United Nations Security Council, whether it can have a position on the issue on Myanmar. It can, in a way, affect the situation. Yeah. So yes.
I mean, it is interesting to note that UN Security Council has come up with a resolution that has been agreed by all the members on Myanmar. And there are news items which point out that India has played an important role in the drafting of that resolution carefully to ensure that the interests are taken care of. And there is a resolution that comes out of it. So therefore, in that sense, being present in United Nations Security Council has ensured that there is some amount of consensus, at least on drafting a resolution and getting it passed in terms of responding to situation in Myanmar. So that's one of the things. And as I pointed out, what would be India's role in terms of the political crisis there? This time I notice, I mean, we have this twin track approach, right, of calling for democracy, but at the same time engaging the Myanmar military. But this time I think there is going to be, the call for democracy is going to be slightly more louder, slightly more strong. Because the recent statement of the government has clearly indicated that there is a deep concern. I mean, we did not say words like this is something for conversations are happening, there is a roadmap and things will move on. We did not indulge in that kind of language, which indicates that this twin track approach of engaging military and also calling for democratic reforms will happen, but there will be more emphasis on calling for democratic reforms. Because it is in India's interest that Myanmar remains open and transparent country. It is only openness and transparency which will ensure that there is diversity of players in Myanmar's economy and diversity of interactions. If Myanmar is open, so I mean, it is relatively more open and has participatory forms of government. Because if it becomes more closed economically, then Japan, India, and others cannot play a major role in Myanmar's economy. If it becomes very closed, continues to be very closed politically, then it becomes very difficult for these countries to engage with Myanmar as well. So therefore, I think this time in this twin track approach, there will be greater emphasis on push for democracy.
Great. I think our time is short. We are running short of time. And there were other comments I just can see, which I think we can hold out, and we can the organizers can send it to you separately and you can answer. Thank you so much for your touching upon a wide range of issues, bringing out the kernel of and shedding light upon so different views. I think now I can just pass it on to Pallavi, and it's very difficult to summarize what you have, with the discussions which you have, which you have brought upon and you have discussed. So I think it is time to call upon Pallavi and Shreyas to do the rest of the things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir.
Thank you, Mihir.
Thank you, Mihir. Thank you for just making this a very engaging discussion. And Sanjay, definitely, there is so much that I think there are more questions that I have definitely, and I'm sure the audience has, because you've given us so much food for thought. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and definitely thank you to Sanjay and Mihir. Next week, we have a session on Central Asia. We'll be sending across the link later. And also, like I said at the start, we have the Swiss ambassador speaking with us in 2 weeks. So keep an eye on our social media pages for the updates for that. And have a good evening, everyone. Good day. I'm everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, Pallavi. Thank you, Shreyas. Thank you, Asian Pathfinders, for this engaging discussion on Myanmar, a country that doesn't get much attention, as Mihir would attest.
Yes.
It's an important country for India, at least, given its location. Grateful that you have been proactive in facilitating these conversations on Myanmar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a nice day.
Yeah,
Thanks.
bye.
Have a nice day.